Hi, I'm Dr. Chuck Betters, and I have a question from Jeremiah chapter 14 and verse 11 that someone wants to know the answer to, and it goes like this. In Jeremiah 14:11, Jeremiah 7:16, and Jeremiah 11:14, God seems to be telling Jeremiah not to pray for the people. Is there a point at which God will no longer save me out of my suffering to hear my prayers of repentance? Well, the question, I think, is important because it does raise two issues. Number one, why did God say to Jeremiah, don't pray for the people? In fact, he actually uses the words, don't pray for the welfare of the people. Don't pray that everything's going to be all right. Because then he says, though they fast, I will not hear their cry. Though they offer burnt offering and grain offering, I will not accept them. But I will consume them by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. And then secondly, there does come a time when we reach a point of reprobation where God gives us over to our sin. And prayers of intercession, although rare, prayers of intercession are not to be prayed. What he's telling Jeremiah here is that the people are making offerings. They're going to church. They're singing hymns. They're hearing the word. They're doing all the things that are expected of them, but they're doing it with sour hearts. They're doing it with hearts that are not in shape. They're doing it with hearts that are not bent on the glory of God. They're doing it with impure motives. It really kind of takes us back to the whole story of Cain and Abel from the very beginning. When Cain was offering his offerings to God and Abel was offering his offerings to God, God chose Abel's offering not because of what the offering was, because both of these boys brought the very best of what they had available, but because of the heart with which Abel offered his sacrifice versus Cain, who offered it with an impure heart. So God basically is saying to us here, interceding for people and praying for people who are making offerings with hearts that are not right is an exercise in futility. So he tells Jeremiah, I've hit a point of no return. I've hit a point of reprobation. I've hit a point where the people have been delivered over to their sin. Now, we never know when that point comes. We are not to assume that someone has reached a point of reprobation where God has delivered them over to their sin. That's only between them and God. There's a hardness of heart that takes place, and we do not know when that hardness of heart occurs, at which time God says, I've delivered them over to their sin. So intercessory prayer no longer is going to matter. We have that example for us in the scriptures again and again and again, where God gives the people over to their sin, gives them over to a reprobate mind. And in Jeremiah, that's a prime example where the people of God had become no different than the people surrounding them, the unbelievers who surrounded them. You couldn't tell the difference between the believers who were praying the prayers, going through the exercises, singing the songs, reading the scriptures, obeying all the law, but their hearts were not in tune with God's. They were not in tune with the Spirit of God. And so their offerings were meaningless. And so God says to Jeremiah, don't pray for them. Intercessory prayer is not going to matter because I have delivered them over to their sin. Now, those instances are rare. When we read of this in Jeremiah, those are rare situations in which God says, cease praying for the salvation of someone. Now, unless God tells you directly to stop praying for someone, and the only way in which he would do that is through the scriptures, you are to continue to pray and pray and pray that God would bring salvation to lost souls everywhere, that God would bring salvation to your own heart, to your own brokenness, that he would bring mercy to you in your suffering, that we are never to cease praying. In fact, in the New Testament, we read just the opposite, that we are to pray without ceasing, that our prayers are to be unceasing. That is, we are to have a mindset that God is at work in us. He is at work in my heart and my neighbor's heart, and we are to pray and to intercede for those who are without Christ. And so we don't know when that point of reprobation is reached. We are not to make that assumption. We cannot assume that God has written someone off, so to speak. Only God knows that. Until then, we are to pray without ceasing. We are to have the mind of Christ, the mind of humility, praying for those who do not know him, praying for those who maybe want to give up in the midst of their pain and sorrow. We are to pray that God would sustain them, never ever to cease praying for those who are in need of Christ.